I'll keep it brief. The year is 2030. Is 8K gaming a thing? John, what do you think?
I mean, it'll probably be at least similar to today, where technically a thing. But I actually think people have largely, thankfully, have not really taken that much interest in it, because I think it's just the pixel pitch is so small at that point that it's not really that useful in most situations. Like if you're sitting back in a living room and looking at a TV, until you're like getting into like Samsung the wall territory, I feel like 8K is going to be almost impossible to perceive. And I think 8K has so many pixels that developers will continue to want to pour that pixel power into other things. And I think 4K is still going to be good enough. This isn't like before where, going from 1080p to 4K became more useful because TVs were getting noticeably larger. You actually could see like a visible difference, right? With 4K becoming much sharper. But
Sure.
I mean, Rich, you had an 8K TV for a while, right?
Yeah.
And now you went back to 4K. I don't think you feel like you've lost any sort of perceived resolution or sharpness or anything, right?
No, not in the slightest.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah, basically, I've said it in the past, you're paying an immense cost in GPU power for what essentially presents as good anti-aliasing.
Yep.
And there's great ways to get good anti-aliasing now, certainly in the PC space with the arrival of DLAA and native AA for FSR. So, that's kind of negating the need to actually brute force gigantic resolutions. I can't really see the argument for, I'm looking at now across at my 48-inch 4K screen. Maybe there'd be an argument for a higher resolution. Whether it needs to actually sort of quadruple up to 8K is certainly debatable. And I just don't really see the need for it. Ultimately, you need software.
Yeah.
I suppose PC can actually provide 8K experiences. And, the 4090 is actually a pretty reasonable 8K card if you're using DLSS.
True.
But, elsewhere, games, historically have driven high definition content. Going back to Xbox 360, it sort of was a great gateway into moving to an HD display. But we're not seeing a mainstream device that's going to be doing 8K anytime soon.
Even if you could, let's say you had a high-end PC that could do 8K, would people really want to go for 8K 60 FPS max when they could go 4K 120 or higher? I think instead what we've seen is a push towards higher refresh rates, especially in the PC space, where we use 4K monitors because we're using those big 4K OLED screens, but I think most PC gamers are not actually using even 4K resolution screens. 1440p is kind of the sweet spot, or more like some of those ultra wide resolutions, but they're all sub 4K, and more instead they're focused on pushing really high refresh rates.
Yeah.
There's
been no
1440p still going strong for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And 1080p is still remarkably still, the number one resolution.
Because it's if you're building a mid to lower end system and hardware's still good enough, if you have like a mid to low end card, you can still push a lot of frames as long as your resolution's in check, right? So, 1080p on a 1080p screen is going to look better than 1080p on a higher res screen.
If we're at the point where at 2024, 4K is still a minority, then there's still a long way to go until that becomes the standard before we can even start thinking about even higher resolutions. And if we are thinking about even higher resolutions, it does start in the living room. And, even at 75 inch, which was what my 8K screen was, I just didn't see a compelling use case for it. And I didn't actually see that much in the way of 8K media content, outside of gaming that actually made it worthwhile. And I'm not seeing that change. And I think part of the reason for that is, the streaming demands to actually make 8K decent. If we are talking about videos via like Netflix or whatever, the bandwidth requirements for that would be huge. And, possibly not that great.
Actually, you might end up sacrificing other aspects of the encode, right?
Yeah,
like your bit rate and such suffers more, and like you end up with more macro blocking, even if the resolution's technically higher.
Yeah,
and you look at the way stuff's filmed, like the practicality of like film lenses and such. Like they're not really taking advantage of that extra sharpness by and large.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the world of films, I mean, you've got 8K cameras, red cameras, and even 12K, but it's usually they zoom into it. You use that as a tool to get the best framing and then work from that. So, but as you say, Rich, it's about the whole pipeline to get 8K to your TV, and that involves the renderer, the PC for gaming, and the internet being there for the internet speeds being there for streaming films. And I think the only use case I can think of for 8K is if you've got a massive display where you can really make out the individual pixels. But yeah, we're talking cinema sized, really to make the most of that. I've been happy with this I'd be happy still. I'm happy still playing games at a native 1440p on this 4K. There's a lot of games where I'm like, well, this is still very good. I'm very happy with that.
I mean, one thing I will say is that, assuming we do hit 2030 here and it is about 8K gaming, there is still this sort of, there's a push now for wider scalability for games, and that is being driven by stuff like Steam Deck, right? So, the demands being placed on games in terms of scalability, the notion that you've got to support these lower end devices does mean that, well, 2030, we could be looking at like the, I don't know, the RTX 9090. And, there'll still be this gigantic gap between what a handheld can do and what a fully spec'd out PC could do. And maybe there would be sort of like just, it will just be able to do it, and maybe the displays will arrive in full force and people might buy into that in a world where people are buying 27-inch 4K screens for some reason. So maybe it will happen just sort of organically, but I can't see it being a quote unquote thing, as Aliasing Anonymous says there. But, could be proved wrong. And ultimately, the experience has got to be palpably improved. And based on my first-hand experiences with an 8K screen, nah.